Hello, everyone. My name is Mikolaj. And we already heard I work as a designer and developer. In the past few years, I've spent mostly building products, such as Snowflake and Sanity. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about my experience with both of those fields, working with design and working with development. We have roughly half an hour, so I'll try to squeeze as much as possible into that time. But if you'd like to dig deeper into those topics, I also run a newsletter related to that kind of stuff. If you'd like to subscribe, you can find me under decodingdesign.xyz. Let's get started. So I introduced myself to you as a designer and developer, which is a bit ironic because when I started to learn those things, which was like about 15 years ago, no one ever told me that those are two separate jobs. I just thought that this is, like a fun hobby for a teenager. And only later, when I realized that you can make money with this hobby, I had to choose which kind of job should I do. And at that point, I decided to be more of a designer. And I think that those 15, 20 years ago, it was pretty common that people would do both of those things. And only later, like we as an industry, started to draw much thicker lines. But recently, I think that those lines are again getting more blurred. And it's again even more important for designers to understand more about technology. However, that doesn't make it any more obvious. What does it really mean in practice? It's like, in reality, how much tech should designers understand? I will try to answer this question in three parts. The first one will be about environment, the environment we work in. The second one about knowledge and topics we should be aware of, discussions we should participate in, decisions we should make. And the third one will be about skills, like the actual hard skills people can learn to become more technical, to level up their collaboration with tech, coding, no code, and so on. OK, let's start with environment. And this is not like the core part of this talk, so I want to go through this pretty quickly. But I also didn't want to skip it like totally, just because I think this is the base for everything else to make any sense. Like without that, you just like everything else I will say just doesn't really matter. And when it comes to technical skills, I think like one thing I would love you to remember from this talk about the environment is that learning those skills is usually the best if you do it from people around you. Okay. You can do online courses, you can read, you can try to embrace this knowledge on your own, but it's really freaking hard. And I think the funniest and the most natural way to understand those topics is by learning from other people, by doing things together. And on that point, I just want to share a few practices that my teams were implementing in my previous jobs. And maybe you find some of this inspiring. So one thing that I really enjoyed working in both Sanity and Snowflake was working in team trios. That usually means that a project or some larger part of the product would be managed by three people, by a product manager, by a designer, and by a technical lead or an engineering manager. And this helps the whole team to stay on the same page and also enforces better communication. Make sure like there's some right balance between those fields. And this is how like the whole structure of the team in the first place enforces the environment in which you can learn about technology. This is also about the process and how we involve technical folks in the process. A good example of that could be involving developers as heavily as you can at the beginning of the project, so making like a full journey together. Something we've done a lot at Sanity was organizing cross-functional workshops that would always include developers. And this not only helps for those meetings to produce more substantial insights, but it would also help to build this common language, common understanding from the very start and involve those people. Another example of how you can involve tech in your process is in research. So at Sanity, we often conducted research together with developers, which means they would be a part of interviews we do. They would sit on those interviews, they would have some of their own questions to ask, they would ask follow-up questions, help us write insights. And this might sound counterintuitive in many cases, but this really, really helped us to make more substantial insights, to really dig deeper from like technical standpoint into user problems. So process, and one more thing I want to mention is rituals. Especially for some reason in like design parts of the orgs, the rituals are often very exclusive, like kind of closed. Like this is the moment when we can finally sit together and discuss design things without anyone else asking stupid questions about design. And yeah, I mean, to some extent, this is good. This is good to have your own safe space when you don't have to explain every word you say, because it's some weird jargon. But on the other hand, including the other parts of your org in those rituals, at least from time to time, could be super beneficial. What I've done a lot was inviting like a single person, usually a developer, to a design critique or a design review meeting, and that person would participate as any other, which again helped a lot, not only to get those people more involved, but also to just build connections with those people that would later benefit like the whole product in the long run. Last bit, documentation. So speaking, making, meeting, talking, that's one thing. Another thing is writing. Like, as you build more complex stuff, you need to document them. And it's critical that this documentation is not like an isolated entity that a product manager writes on their own in the evening, but it's something that you all work on together. And this really helps to enforce common understanding of common goals and common language within the team. OK, this all might sound like reasonable advice, I hope, but also it only works with a few caveats applied. And the first one I want to say is that involving people is one thing, but you have to also listen and understand. And what I mean by that, as far as, you know, this is common sense, right? But I know from my own experience how easy it is to have a developer on a meeting, and then the moment they start saying words you don't understand, you just zone out, you stop listening, things are done. And this is the worst thing that you can do, because you're just wasting each other's time. And there are basically, I think, usually there are two things that should happen in such case. You either stop them right there and you just, you know, agree that this is too technical and you should move forward, or you try to really dig deeper and understand it. But you shouldn't try to understand everything. I think this is fair to say, no matter what technologies you work in, what type of product you work with, that there are some things that are indeed too technical, and you just shouldn't care about them. And this is the true art, to know like which of those technical bits should be your concern, which decisions you should be a part of, which meetings you should be invited to, and which are maybe, you know, something you really shouldn't worry about. And yeah, this is about management, this is about your company's culture, but this is also about your skills. This is about you proactively getting involved into things that matter. And for that, getting to know your team, like building this right culture, it's critical, but it's also about your knowledge. Like if you have that knowledge, if you know yourself which bits are important to your work, it gets so much easier. So if we think about knowledge, if we think about like all those things that lie somewhere in between design and code, there is indeed a lot. And I think it's important to understand that you don't have to know everything, but it's really, really good to at least know what you don't know. And there is plenty of that. There are some usual suspects like accessibility and performance, but there is also a ton of other things around. And a lot of them might sound very technical, but if you really try to understand them, if you really dig into them, then you realize that they're so much more about user experience than about what's like the day-to-day job of a developer. So, okay, let's stop right here and try to play the devil advocates for a moment. A usual argument would be communication should solve it. You should just meet and talk about it and figure it out. And yeah, and I agree that like good communication is critical. It's kind of like a base. Without it, nothing will work. But it is not enough. And to put it bluntly, it is not enough because this is your job as a creative to come up with the right ideas, to come up with the right solutions to the problem. And to come up with good ideas, you need to know about your constraints, you need to know about your possibilities, about your limitations. And this is not something you can just figure out in a quick back and forth with a dev. And yeah, constraints don't limit creativity. Constraints foster creativity. Only knowing what you can do, you will come up with your best ideas. And following that rule, this is what helps you avoiding what I usually call uneducated optimism and uneducated pessimism. By uneducated optimism, I mean situations when you assume with your common sense that something would be easy, but it's very often not. Like a classical example is coding a select field that in its basic form on the web, yeah, you can do it in 5 seconds and it just works very robustly, very efficiently everywhere. But maybe you just want to look at it a tiny bit different and you want the focus state to be gray and you want the arrow to be a bit smaller. And most of designers have no clue whatsoever how much hassle is that. And of course you can use ready-made solutions. You can just import it from some library and it works. But no matter how good the solution is that you reuse, there will always be an overhead for performance, an overhead for the future maintainability, for the future scalability of what you work on. And that's also as important as the user experience or, as the color of a chevron icon in a corner. And yeah, maybe the select feels like a typical example of a case when a developer would come to a designer and tell them, oh, we can actually do a simple select field. It will be so much more performant and so much easier to do, and then, happy ever after. But there are so many cases when this won't happen, just because your ideas went in a completely wrong direction in the first place. And then you would have to take 5 steps back to then take another 5 steps forward to find a solution that is technically optimal. And in such case, yeah, communication is just not enough. So this is what I call uneducated optimism. And uneducated pessimism is, on the other hand, when you just don't think about something or dismiss some idea from the very beginning just because you assume it would be too hard to do. Let's say this is an example of web transitions API, like a API for building smooth transitions between web pages. And I very rarely see that on the web. And with a right technical setup, adding this is, yeah, literally a 10 seconds job. But people don't do that, I think first because many developers don't know about it, but also because designers don't know about it. And then they don't even realize that doing this would be super simple. So yeah, maybe they just don't even consider this a part of their job. Or they think this would be hard because they never seen it. And they don't think this is something that they can use reliably. All right, now I want to jump into a few more concrete topics and give you examples from those particular fields. The first, usual suspect, accessibility. Go to any design conference, you will probably find another talk about accessibility and a story about contrast, color blindness, touch targets, legibility, etc. And that's amazing. It's cool that we talk about those things. It's not as cool at the moment when, after covering those bits, designers assume that now they know everything they should about accessibility and call it a day. Because accessibility is so much more than those bits. And yeah, a lot of those things kind of seem technical, but if you dig into what they mean, they're kind of your job. Let's take descriptive labels, like the labels for the elements that do not show on screen, later used by, for example, screen readers. If you don't have a dedicated writer on a team or a dedicated accessibility specialist, I bet that you are the very best person in the company to do this. Or focus management. Like, let's say focus states, they have to be designed, like deciding how focus flows through the page, like in which order elements are focused to ensure the best experience. That's kind of your job. Or designing motion and animations. Some people would have all the animations in a product switched off due to accessibility settings. And yeah, like someone has to design what happens in such case. So like, if you have the animation switched off, what should happen instead so the interaction in the app is still understandable? You can still like follow what happened. And you could continue. Another thing, web browsers. I'm talking a lot about the web because that's what I usually work with. So sorry if there's not enough of mobile here. But I hope that at least a lot of the stuff is like quite related to both. So when it comes to web browsers, there are also some bits that are just very good to know, even if you're just a designer and have nothing to do with code. For example, browser compatibility, how things look in different browsers and how they work differently in different browsers. How navigation works, like those back and forth buttons, and history, and what happens in the URLs. And here I want to give you an example. This is an e-commerce example from a well-known company. And there is so much more wrong happening in the screen that I could do like a whole separate talk about it. But I just want to show you like a few bits. The first one, I think this is my favorite, is this back button. So what do you think happens when you click a back button in the interface on the web? Well, let's assume someone sent you this link, like in a message or something. You don't have a history of that website. Well, spoiler alert, the thing breaks. This button doesn't work then, because there's nothing to go back to. But let's assume they thought about it. And when you hit a back button, it goes back to the product page, like the list of products. OK, fair enough. Sounds like a reasonable solution. But what if you then hit the native back button in the browser? Like, should you go even further up in hierarchy? Or should you go back to the product page so then the back button is a forward button? It gets really confusing. I think the long story short is like, try not to do back buttons on the web. A much better pattern, like more suitable for the web environment, in this case would be a breadcrumb. OK, forward. There's an image gallery. You can swipe it left and right to switch between images. Fantastic. One thing they haven't thought about is that in most of mobile browsers, you can navigate through your browser history by swiping left and right. So when I try to switch images, I suddenly go to a previous or the next page. Another thing, this beautiful bottom sheet. So yeah, here's the thing. Does it work? Doesn't? Now it works. Still no. Now, let's try. OK, it works. So the bottom sheet, a pattern brought from mobile apps, seems innocent. But again, like you have to swipe up and swipe down for it to work. Do you know what happens in mobile browsers when you swipe down? You reload the page. So like those patterns just interfere, and when you try to close the overlay, you just reload the whole website. Oh, and the last bit, the color picker. And this is about URLs, like what information you store in the URL. And about how this can go very wrong. The short story is that imagine you want to buy this thing, but you prefer the white color. So you checked how the white color looks like. And this is being saved to the state of the website, not to the URL. And you then just, hit the share button in the browser, like logical thing to do. You send the link to your partner. Hey, can you please buy that? And they're, yeah, of course, looks lovely. I'm ordering this right now. We'll be home next week. And then you open the package next week, and it's in the wrong color. You know why it's in the wrong color? Because the color information was not saved to the URL. You just send them the default URL that shows like the default variant. So yeah, that's kind of user experience, I would say. Okay, another bucket, scrolling. Everything related to scrolling. You don't need to know how to code those things, but you should totally know how scrolling works. And, for example, why you should never, ever do vertical scroll if you don't really need it. Or two-dimensional scroll, that's usually even worse. And what are nested scrolls and why they are bad? Or what is the difference between window scroll and element scroll? And what are fixed elements and sticky elements? And how to design them. Yeah. A lot of fun things to explore. Animation. So I don't know if this is just me, but most of designers I know, they kind of steer away from navigation. They're like, okay, this is not my job. And if they are forced to do some of it, they usually just use native transitions or some functions in a design tool, and yeah, and think that the job is done. And yeah, like in many cases, that's very much enough. But if you want to dig deeper into this topic, there's so much to explore. And first, it's really good to know what kind of transitions, what kind of animations are native to the platform you design for. On mobile platforms like Android, iOS, there's so much you can do with very little effort if you just know which kind of interactions, which kind of transitions are native. And it even works on the web, like what I showed you a moment ago, the View Transitions API. Those are native animations for the web, very easy to do. And even if you don't go that direction, it's kind of useful to know like what technologies you work with. So let's say on the web, you usually animate things like the simple stuff using CSS or for vector graphics, SVG. And again, like some characteristics of that might be very eye-opening. So let's say when you animate things with CSS, the impact of that on performance can be very different. If you animate stuff like opacity or doing simple transforms, like rotating things, scaling them, then it's usually very performant, very nice, and very smooth. Animating effects or colors or gradients, oh my God. Like, it's not only just a bad pattern to overload someone's machine just for the sake of animating a stupid gradient, but it's also that it will look bad. It will look choppy. You don't want that on your product. It will look cheap. And of course, there's a lot of tools that try to fix this, and a lot of libraries and apps that try to do it in a more efficient way. Examples, GSAP, Framer Motion. And again, like, you don't have to learn to use them. You don't have to learn to code using those things. But if you just go on a website and see what those things can do, that can be very inspiring. So yeah, I showed you that thing, like those simple transitions. Another example is how it works is this. This is also like very simple, but it's super simple if you work in a right stack. So if you use a certain framework, library that supports it. And I think that most of us would agree that we very rarely are involved in a discussion about like which framework or which library to use. Starting with the fact that I'm not sure like how many of us even know the difference between a library and a framework. And a short exercise, just for us to illustrate the point. Can you please put your hand up if you could now come to me and explain what's the difference between a framework and a library on the web? And I'm pretty sure like most of you work with those on an everyday basis. Anyone? Okay, I have a simpler one. Front-end and back-end. Yes, okay. So for example, it's useful to know what's the difference between front-end and back-end. Because you want to talk to a developer, and you have 20 developers, so at least if you know if you should talk to the front-end or to the back-end, you choose between 10 people, not between 20 people. Amazing. And it's also useful to know what's the difference between a framework and a library, because then you can be a part of this decision, and you can tell them that this is the kind of effect I would like to achieve, and this effect will only be possible with some kind of a library. And maybe this is possible in your project, but you just haven't been in that conversation at the right point of time. I have more, but I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up anymore, but you can answer to yourself. And do you know the difference between server-side and client-side, or things being statically rendered and dynamically rendered? This is about like the bits of your website. When do they render? When do they load? Which are computed on the server and then sent to the browser, and which works in the browser. And you might think you totally don't care, but this really defines how the interactions work later. So let's say, can you make the data live? Can it update simultaneously when, let's say, a user types? Or is it something that will update only when they are restart the whole app or they reload the whole website? So yeah, it can really, for example, influence the type of interaction you design. Single-page applications and multi-page applications. Another useful thing to know, like kind of architectures you work with, monolith and composable. I bet most of us at this point here work with composable architectures, and yeah, maybe they don't even know about it. But once you do, it's so much easier to design things in a way that would later be understandable to developers. You will just speed things up. Yeah, I had some more here, but yeah, approaches like bottom-up and top-down, how you approach the whole development process. This defines at what point your designs are started to be coded. Pretty important. Or how you formulate things and how you code things. Is it more imperative or more declarative? Or even like things inside the product, like authorization and authentication. This is a very mixed bag, I know, like very random, but just to give you some examples of like technical lingo that is very useful in your conversations with technology, or very useful for you to know when you try to be a part of some important decision or something. Yeah, so let's try to summarize it a bit. I think what I'm trying to say is that when we design things, and we try to solve things just for communication with developers, to some extent, we expect them to, be a part of the design process and to come with their design input to solve problems. And this is totally fine. Like, this is how this should work. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it should also work the other way around. So, like, if we expect the design input from developers, we should also expect some technical input from designers, and then meet somewhere halfway. And to do that, to really meet halfway, we also need to talk about skills. Yeah, so those technical skills that we can learn to level up our collaboration with tech and to meet them halfway. Before I go into anything really technical, I first want to mention design tools, because something I hear a lot is that like if you want to nail delivery, if you want to, your product to have amazing user experience at the very end, you should nail your usage of design tools. You should learn all the design token stuff and auto layouts and variables, and the list goes on. But I'm not saying you shouldn't learn those things. It's pretty cool and can speed up your own work. It can be useful to you, but it's not necessarily that useful to the final quality of what you're building. And there's a lot of examples that prove it. If you look at the really top-notch products, at the really best companies out there, they rarely give a damn about design tools. If you want an example, here's an example from Linear. What they do is they usually just screenshot an app, do a quick sketch on top of the screenshot, just explore ideas, move into code as fast as possible, and from that place, they just always treat the code as the main source of truth, iterate on it to the point when they just start all over. They make another screenshot, and again draw on top of the screenshot. They really don't care about design tools. And sometimes it's also just the design tools are too limiting. To give you examples from my past jobs, when I was working for Snowflake, working in a design tool, in a tool that is all about data, felt a bit counterintuitive. So as far as we could, we tried to avoid it. Because like, how can you, design a data-heavy analytic tool when you're drawing boxes, like when you don't have real data? It just doesn't make much sense, because validating your ideas is very much dependent on connecting it to the real data source. And a similar story was happening in my previous company at Sanity. And this app is all about content management and creating content. And do you know what's one thing that I still totally don't get why Figma didn't implement? Text inputs. Like, why you cannot type anything in that thing? And yeah, like, how would you make a prototype of a content platform if you cannot type? How do you do usability testing? How do you, yeah, like show it to a client or try to get the sense of what you're designing? It just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, like what we've done, we've mostly just worked in code. And we like tried to develop a system that would make it as easy and as fast as possible for everyone on the team. Okay, so what are we left with? No-code counts as like an obvious candidate to solve those issues. You can definitely type in the designs that you've done in a no-code tool. It's a great advancement. Yeah. Okay, maybe disclaimer before I move any forward. Those next two slides, this will be about like what I usually hear when I hear a designer saying, I want to learn no-code, which is I want to learn Webflow, I want to learn Framer, and of course no-code is so much wider than that, and maybe some things I will say don't apply to those other bits, but bear with me. Okay, so no-code. And no-code is absolutely amazing for certain use cases. And there's a lot of good reasons to learn no-code. If you want to work for the agency that uses it, or if you want to work with clients independently, and you want to, don't be dependent on developer, and you then want those clients to be able to edit the website you make for them very easily. Great. Great use cases. But it's also important to remember that there is so much more things that no-code is horrible at than the things that no-code is good at. And when it comes to learning, yeah, it's definitely a good starting point. And what I mean by that is that the learning curve is definitely a bit, gentler and maybe just a bit more fun to work. But in the long run, that's totally a dead end. And mostly because you're always dependent on a tool. And you don't learn the actual proper standards, you learn the tool that you're using. And this is usually not the same thing. Like if we think about standards, things like HTML, CSS, like those folks have been around here for 20, 30 years. And I'm pretty sure they will be thriving in the next 20 years to come. I couldn't say the same thing about popular no-code tools. We don't even know like which one of them will be the top one in 2 years from now. So there's also a reason why I say that. Why I think that a lot of those tools will go into rapid changes. And this is this moment of this talk when please excuse me, I have to mention AI. Yeah, so should designers learn AI? That's the question. I'm not going to answer it. I don't even know what that means. But what I can tell you is that it will disrupt the way we work. And if we look at programming, that's the funny tweet that Andrei Karpathy shared, I think, a few weeks ago. That's a guy that founded AI at Tesla and later OpenAI. That's a company you might have heard about. And he said that the hottest new programming language is English. And what he meant by this is that there is so far you can already get today with programming just with natural language. So much you can do without writing any code at all. It starts to sound like no code, right? And I'm pretty sure that there's a very short way from this to this. And I'm not saying that soon, every designer will become a developer and that we will all just happily auto-generate code and paste it into production. But what I mean is that there's a huge potential in that for a lot of parts of our process. And AI might not come to take our jobs, but it might definitely come to take our tools. And yeah, let's not go any deeper into that. But if you want to just explore things on your own, just have some fun, one of the cool things that I recently play with is a code editor called Cursor. You don't have to use it to write code, but you can, for example, search it on YouTube and see what people built using Cursor and how far they got without literally writing any code in prototyping. And yeah, like when it comes to this prototyping thing, think about use cases, right? I'm not saying everyone just generates code in Cursor and put it in your code base. But think about you doing a quick prototype that you can share with your team in 5 minutes. A prototype that have inputs you can type in, and real data, and real components from your design system that actually work, and that you don't have to update 5 different falling apart variants, and updating some nested instances with weird variables, and so on. Yeah. If you want to generate some things, I'm just saying. A popular tool that's recently quite hyped is a V0 thing made by Vercel, or you can just ask AI. Claude, something similar to ChatGPT, if you haven't used it yet, recently introduced a feature when you ask it to generate some code, it essentially can already run it and show you the final result. It's pretty fun. And yeah, so this brings us to the last point. And as old in this industry, a question, should designers code? And again, I'm not going to answer this question. I think to some extent you can already guess what I would like to say here. But instead, I want to look at this picture again and think for a second. Like, how does it happen that such amazing teams with so many fantastic individuals ship something that is so bad? Like, why? How does it happen? Well, this is not about they don't having good people on the team. They have amazing people on the team. But what happens is that those people are skilled in very certain areas. They're amazing researchers, they're amazing UX designers, they're amazing front-end developers, but then there's a gap in between them. And this is the gap that causes those things to happen, and later the things just not to work. So if you want to bridge this gap, it's not about designers learning to code. It's not about developers becoming designers. Although some of them might want to learn new things, and that would be fantastic. The point is to build teams that are more diverse, teams that want to collaborate, teams that are used to working with each other on a daily basis, and teams that, at the very end of the day, do things together and are just more diverse in their skill set. So they meet in the middle, or in the ideal case, they build what I call a skills overlap. And this is how the best teams out there are structured. This is how the best teams work and how the best products are built. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. And now we still have some minutes left for a Q&A session. So, do we have anyone willing to start a question from public? Okay, I don't see it, so I'll give you some time because I have one. Do you remember a situation when you were guilty of uneducated optimism?
Oh yeah, 1,000 times. Yeah, so I think that's like a thing that we all have to embrace, that it happens all the time. And it not only happens in technical context. I think it as often happens in the context of business, when you think that something would be very easy to sell or very easy to explain. So yeah, I guess it's a part of the process, and we all just do it every day and learn from it.
Anything most recent that comes to your mind?
There's, I think like one of those things that comes to my mind is when I recently worked for a client that have a very high usage on a website. And before working on that project, I was not as sensitive about performance of the things I work with. And yeah, I didn't really care if there's like, 20 SVG assets or 10 SVG assets. Because previously I worked for startups that usually would have a workload that doesn't care about this kind of things. And I think just the thing that it taught me is that it's just good not to take things for granted. Just test them. Even if you think you know, just check it twice. It's usually that simple. And don't underestimate small numbers. Because sometimes, you focus on giving the best user experience, thinking that it means making it more intuitive, but then you just make the whole interface, my example, slower by half a second, and this actually brings the conversion down, much, much lower than a new design fixes it.
Okay, that's a very interesting insight. Thank you. So now that you had some time to think, do you have any questions for Mikolaj? Yeah, I got one. I got two. Yeah, we got one. We got a queue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I find it to be super insightful. Really interesting topic that you embarked on today. However, I wanted to ask for a specific way that you could, I don't know, share with us on how to facilitate the bridging the gap, the skills gap between the developers and designers. Do you have any specific way to do that?
I think that like the not so fun part of the answer is that to some extent this is very tightly related to the company culture and to the goals that the leadership sets and how they form the teams. And I think that you need to have those people on board for that to happen. It's very, from my experience at least, it's really tough for that to happen fully organically, like bottom up. With this being said, there's always, always worth trying. So what you would usually recommend as the best way to facilitate it on your own is to just focus on working together from the very beginning. And in practice, that might mean involving the whole team in the process, like the workshops at the beginning, but also just doing things real time together. In programming, there's such a thing as co-programming. Some of you might heard about. It means that two people, usually in the office, they sit together and they just code the same thing together at the same time. And you can also do this with a designer. It's really fun to do. Just take a developer, or if you're a developer, take a designer, sit together, don't exchange Jira tickets, just sit and do things together. And usually, this is a much easier idea to sold to your manager than restructuring the whole team, right? So maybe silly things like that. Just sell it as a playful ritual that you might want to do to, build your team spirit.
Great, thank you. So hot seating with the designer and the developer is the best way, yeah?
From my experience, it really works.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
It also helps you make friends.
Okay, I saw that we got another one, and this will be our last, yeah?
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. And my question is, where do you think this gap begins? Like between developers and designers? Because recently I had such a story that I developed just landing page, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I was using it, like doing everything as I was taught in a design school, like you need to use the grid, you need to use that and that. I did all of that, and then I handed this design to my husband, who is a developer, and he was like, it doesn't make any sense. All these grids and all that stuff. I need to know how to scale these elements. I need to know how it works, like from the front-end perspective. And he started to wonder why designers are being taught initially in terms that developers do not understand, or it doesn't make any sense to them when it comes to developing, actually, all of it. So my question is, do you think it starts like from the courses for designers, for developers, that we are being taught about the process, but in two completely other perspectives and languages, or where does it start at all?
That's a very good one, and I'll give you an answer that I myself can relate to, which might not be the best for every use case, but something that at least sometimes causes this to happen is that people treat different parts of their work as the source of truth, and they care about different objectives. And let's say designers, they cherish their Figma files, and they want the designs to be perfect. They want those things to reflect, like, what's the ideal state. So let's say you do a design, then you ship only half of it, but this was the ideal state. This is what this was supposed to look like. And then you have the reality, which, yeah, is a reality. And yeah, that causes friction. Something that is probably not easy to embrace, but might benefit in the long run, is to always have a single source of truth, to always have like one goal, and to agree that, you know, what really matters is the thing that, to put it bluntly, the thing that makes money, the thing that the user uses, the actual code. And just treat your designs as a tool. Speak to your developers what they need, and they might tell you that they really don't care about your grid, which it's usually like, okay, but it should be on the grid. But then you talk about it, and maybe you can do this grid, but you just figure together what's the best way to implement it. But at the end of the day, just focus on one single source of truth, one thing you deliver together. So you're sure that you have common goals and like the common thing that you're building. It's not like you're fighting towards the best Figma and they're fighting the best code and the business is fighting their business goals and it's all somewhere else.